Hi, my name is Ketan Joshi. I'm a clean energy expert and communicator from Australia. I used to work in the clean energy industry up to about 2017. Since then, I worked in data science for a little while at Australia's chief government science agency. After that, I started writing a book on Australia's history of climate change and where it can go in the future. And I've also been doing some work for an organization that looks at the ethical nature of fossil fuel organizations. So essentially, it looks at what they're doing on climate change and what they're saying, and tries to sort of pressure them into making better decisions on climate change.
Great. I came across you when I was looking across on the Twitter world, and everyone was complaining about Michael Moore's and Jeff Gibbs. I should say Jeff Gibbs,
Yes.
co-produced by Michael Moore, a new film, which caused quite a stir. I mean, the first thing I heard about the film was a press release from 350 where they released a statement of it, and then I say, oh well, I guess I better watch the film. And it was kind of worse than I thought. After that, I was kind of looking around and seeing reactions, and I was quite happy to see that other sane people I know on Twitter, they have the kind of more or less the same view as mine. So maybe we can start. I don't want this whole discussion just be about the film and other stuff as well, but maybe you can start just saying what were your first instant thoughts when you saw the film.
Look, I very much had the same reaction that you did, which is I had some. I went into it with some skepticism. Obviously, I'd seen some things about what was in the film. I'd seen the general sort of tone that it was taking, and I'd also seen that reaction from 350. So I was like, look, this is probably not going to be great, but Michael Moore's on board, and I've kind of seen some of his stuff previously, and I liked it. And I knew that it would be emotive. What I didn't quite have a good feel for is exactly how wrong it would be. I thought maybe it would, sort of skirt around some truths, but the magnitude of wrongness in this film really took me by surprise. And right from the outset, right from the second it starts, that was my initial sort of confusion. Is just like, okay, it can't be that wrong. And then the other thing, as I sort of progressed through the film as I was watching it, the other thing that really stood out to me was, having a lot of familiarity with a lot of the ideas and the arguments and the debates that go around clean energy. I was looking at a lot of the ideas in this film, and I knew the provenance of them. I knew where they came from. They came specifically from fossil fuel advocates like climate change deniers and companies that sell fossil fuels, and those sort of groups in the middle that just exist purely to attack renewable energy. A lot of those ideas came from there. So those two things really took me by surprise. I knew it would not be great, but it turned out to be very bad. And it also turned out to be borrowing very heavily from the library of right-wing ideas.
Yeah, I think that's what struck me earlier. It was quite a bizarre film, wasn't it? It was like a lot of the different kind of views and debunking I've seen in film is that first of all, it doesn't. I'm not quite sure what it tries to do. I mean, what's the objective is, and it goes around different things and don't really connect them. Trying to connect biomass to renewable energy and trying to kind of just group it all together and say it's all bad, and then go down almost like philosophical argument that we should all consume less and we should just stop having kids and stuff like that. So it's I don't know what you thought about it. It just tries to do some things that is not really connected to each other.
Yeah, this is the great mystery of the film, and it's something. I think this is part of the reason why I'm still thinking about this, and why it's still on my mind, even though it came out last week and I wrote my
Yeah,
blog,
me
and
too. Yeah.
but it's strangely hard to forget. And I think the reason behind why I'm still thinking about this is because I still don't understand what the driving force was. So for instance, I had an interview yesterday where I was talking about this scene in the film where they go to this site. It's a concentrating solar thermal site. So you've got these sort of like these troughs of mirrors, these parabolic mirrors on the ground, and they reflect the sun's light, and they heat up this pipe that sits just above it, that's how it collects solar energy. It's a pretty old technology, and it didn't really turn out to be very widely deployable. These days, you're more likely to install solar PV, which is the black, rectangular cells that you see on people's rooftops. Now, what happened in the film is they visit the site of one of these facilities.
That was
and they walk onto it.
Ivanpah concentrated solar farm in the US, right?
It's actually just before that. It's the solar energy generating system in Daggett in California. Okay. Yeah, it's not the one with the tall tower in the middle. It's the sort of rows of ones on the ground. Yeah, and they visit that, and there's nothing there, and they're like, oh my god, I'm looking at this. They sort of gave up on the solar farm, and they just got rid of it, and it's this dusty sort of empty field. But I looked it up, and it's actually, it was replaced. It was midway through being replaced with a solar PV farm. And it's a big one. It's the Sunray 2 and 3 farms. If your viewers want to look it up, you can look up all the statistics on it. You can look up the amount that it generates every year. You can also look up the plans for one nearby. They're expanding it into, there are these sort of like this empty farmland around it. That's it's had a very high level of human impact on that land already, and it's not being used. And I was watching it, and I'm like, you can actually build a serious evidence-based case for companies need to pay more attention to when the renewable energy thing or whatever it is reaches its end of life. Companies need to pay more attention to how you remediate that site and bring it back to it, natural. Yeah. He's right to say that, desert areas are really teeming with life and their ecosystems. But for some reason, he just completely botches the whole thing, right? Like he builds this case from what is essentially a deception, when he could have actually done something accurate and constructive and important, for environmental conservancy, and probably something that renewable energy companies around the world need to pay more attention to. But for some reason, he just completely screws it up. And just goes and visits this site that is just midway through being converted from one thing to another thing. And I think a lot of people are feeling the same, which is basically like, if your goal was this particular goal that you say it is in the film, it doesn't really come through in the shape of the documentary, right? Like it doesn't really, you're not kind of watching it going like, oh, I really felt that you put effort and time into this because you believe in it. You sort of get the impression that he actually almost doesn't care that much about the subject matter.
Yeah. I mean, and I think there's obviously a space for transparency and being honest, and there's a space for criticism of the clean energy industries, right? But the thing is that, first of all, there's these two issues. Why do you choose to criticize the industry and then look at footage that's taken like 10 years ago, right? I mean, that's very bizarre. And you don't really get people in to defend themselves, right? So I think that's one side of things. And I mean, I don't know what your thought is on that. Like, why not criticize? Why do you think that you chose not to criticize maybe like modern technology?
So I think it's an interesting one. I heard a theory. It's sort of the best theory I've heard on this. Professor Leah Stokes, she's at the University of California, Berkeley, and she was interviewed on this podcast I was listening to. I highly recommend it, by the way. It's called Drilled, and they focus on. I listened to it. Yeah. And so they asked her, and she's just like, probably what happened is the pandemic happened, and they're just sitting around at home, and they're like, oh, we've got just so much free time now. What do we do? And they just opened up the folder with all the MP4 files from 2012. They were like, let's just smush this together into a documentary. And now I think that's actually really important to think about. First of all, the very low amount of consideration that they put into this. So they obviously, imagine being faced with that situation, right, where you've got this pile of footage from 8 years ago. Most people would have the instinct. They would either think, okay, I better present this as a historical document. This is what the clean energy industry was like in 2012. They were doing all this stuff. Al Gore was doing this, blah, blah, blah. Here's a snapshot of what things used to be like. And then, when you have the footage from a small solar farm, you can say, this solar farm 2012. I visited the solar farm in 2012. I think most people would inherently understand that that is the honest way to do that. The other option, of course, would be to say, okay, we can partly put this together, but we can't release it until we talk to people who are doing this sort of stuff today. And of course, you can really tell when they're interviewed after the documentary was released. They've been on TV interviews, and they've had the podcast interviews. And I watched them, and I listened to the podcast interviews, and there's this one moment that really struck me when Michael Moore was being interviewed, and he's like, "Oh, look, what we really need is a youth movement. We need some sort of youth environmental movement to really just come on board, and we need to get more young people involved." And I'm just like, how did you miss the whole month of September 2019? How did you miss the world, like the planet's biggest climate marches in the history of climate activism? Cities were just packed, and like it was all over the news. And I'm just like, to miss that, to miss one of the most pivotal moments in the past decade of climate, climate advocacy, I think basically kind of tells you all you need to know, which is that they don't really want to know where it's at. They're not that interested in going, well, I'm curious. I have a natural curiosity to find out how things have changed since I collected this footage and I formed these views in my own mind. And I think that's an ugly sentiment. I think that's a really ugly and damaging sentiment. And then you pair that with the fact that it's been viewed so widely. That's really worrying and concerning, because a lot of people watching it don't have a good feel for how dated it is, and also how badly it's distant from what things are like today. Obviously from a technological perspective, but also from an activism perspective too.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think that actually what I've seen, there's a lot of people who are worried about the destruction of natural world, and they're worried about climate change and the same kind of thing. And if they get a filmmaker who makes such a film, who they respect, and who's world renowned for his previous films, and saying, "Oh, renewables is a sham, and this is the only way to do it," kind of thing, then a lot of them will buy into that. I mean, there's also there are people who've done research, who knows that renewables is not a scam, and they will do the research based on what they're saying in film, and they'll come up on the wrong side of history. But there are a lot of people who are like, I don't know, they're like groupies in a way. They'll just copy what any kind of the idols are doing, and they wouldn't bother doing their own research. And I think that's the really scary element of it.
Yeah, I something that I've been sort of noticing is you can really tell when something has impact when you start to see it manifesting outside of the sort of bubble that you exist in, right? So, like I spend a lot of time on Twitter. I spend a lot of time, talking with other clean energy people, climate change people. But this has just come up, through the little things, like you have a Zoom call with your parents, and you talk to your friend of a friend on Facebook, and you sort of see stuff outside of your normal bubble where people are watching this film and being like, "Oh, wow, my eyes were opened by this. I was really shocked and amazed, and I really don't trust these environment groups anymore, and I don't trust wind and solar anymore." And it's really it's hard to explain. It's hard to explain how shocking and I guess heartbreaking that is, because a lot of the fight that has happened around climate change and clean energy over the past decade, that sort of reached its peak around 2010, 2013, right? And the next few years after that, things quietened down. Things started to get a little bit, I wouldn't log on to things. I wouldn't read the letter sections of papers and see letters from people saying, wind turbines are bad because coal plants have to idle 100% of the time. That's just kind of stopped, right? That was such a strange anachronism when I was watching that film, because it's a fight that a lot of advocates have already had, and they spent a very, very long time crawling out of this hole where it was just like this endless argument back and forth. particularly with climate change denial groups. So they really pioneered and broadcast a lot of these ideas and made them into these sort of really sticky viral memes that you just couldn't escape them, right? Like they were just everywhere. Particularly the thing around renewable energy requiring minerals and requiring the usage of fossil fuels to construct. That was a really big one because it kind of hits this note of like, haha, you thought you were environmental, but the thing that you love is actually, trashing the environment and using fossil fuels. And of course the I want to say brilliance, but of course it's not brilliant, it's horrible. But I guess the cleverness of it is that there is literally no device or machine that you can construct today that doesn't require the use of fossil fuels, right? Like it is a physical impossibility at the moment to do manufacturing and reach the heat that is required without the use of fossil fuels, right? So there are like pilot plants and demonstrations and things like that where you can use sunlight or you can use hydrogen. You can use a bunch of different options that are being trialed, but on the scale that's required to decarbonize the planet's energy system, it is essentially a must-have. Like you have to burn some fossil fuels to get rid of most fossil fuels, right? Like and everybody who's in this kind of just came to terms with that. Like they learnt it, they heard it, they soaked it in, and they thought about the balance and the consequences and, the feeling of like having to participate in something that you're opposed to. And most people came to terms with it. And this guy heard it and he's just like, I'm doing a documentary about this. Like, this is a revelation.
I mean, this case is like the argument about supply chains as well. Like, so if you're going to build an offshore wind farm in the UK, for instance, and you've got to get some of the components from like say Germany or Denmark, you have to transport it, and likely you'll have to transport it by fossil fuels via a truck that haven't been converted to electricity yet, or on a ferry or something. The likelihood is that 10 years ago that transport there'll be a lot more dirty, but and 10 years from now it might have be a lot more cleaner. So it's also, I think, it's also another element is the whole thing about minerals. Okay, we can pick on renewables, and we can pick on electric cars of certain minerals kind of thing, but your smartphone, your computer, your smart TV, your car, well, electric, not like, they almost requires a lot of the same minerals kind of thing. So we can just say, renewables, or we can just look at society as a whole and say, okay, all the stuff we have built a society on, they all need kind of bad stuff. How do we, should we just say we shouldn't use it at all? Should we try to go down a path? How can we actually innovate and get down a path where we actually become as clean and as least impact the environment as possible?
The only response I've seen by the filmmakers to a lot of the criticisms, not just from me, from many different people, has been this FAQ that Michael Moore posted on Twitter. It's not, they're not really frequently asked questions. Like, they're obviously Michael Moore just saying some statements and he's just agreeing with the filmmaker Jeff Gibbs is just agreeing with them. But there is actually one little point in there where Michael Moore says, okay, it's a very bleak film, but you need to, like, I want you to tell me what people can do. Like, what changes can they make to really like help with this? And his answer is incredibly weak, right? Like he just sort of mumbles, like it's written, but you can kind of almost hear him mumbling this. He just kind of talks about like reducing consumption, and he talks about like driving less. I mean, the film opens with him driving, so I don't know what he's talking about. And then like,
and not just a normal car, like it's like a big car. Gas guzzling car, like not even a car, but almost a truck.
Yeah, it's one of those like proper American big and so basically what's revealed there is that he's not grappling with he's obviously not grappling with a lot of the other issues that he talks about in the film, right? Like he's just kind of like he's just hearing something and then repeating it without really putting much effort into investigating its validity. But he's not really grappling with his own answer either, because the answer that he puts forward essentially is that he sort of pleads afterwards that he's not calling for population control, but in the documentary he talks about population a lot. Like he's got this chart where it starts off, and then the population goes up wildly. He's talking about the number of people on the planet, right? There's just no question about it, because there's like he talks about it so much in the film, but then after the film has come out, now he's saying, "Oh, no, I was talking about overconsumption. I think talking about lifestyles people need to sacrifice." And the real problem here is that he's making this hypocrisy claim, like, "Oh, you say you're fighting climate change, but you're not really." But he's not really talking about himself in any sense, right? Like he's not saying, "I've given up my car. I've gone vegan. I've reduced. I'm not buying a new smartphone ever in my life. I'm not buying a new film camera with a lithium-ion battery.
I'm not traveling abroad, or going around on a bike. That's none of that." You're right.
Yeah, and so I think he has no conception of what it is like to advocate for reduced consumption. There are a lot of like really smart, really clever, good people who their whole life is dedicated to saying, "I want people to consume less and therefore have a lower impact on the environment." And as a clean energy advocate, as like a technology advocate, I love that because it makes the job of the technologist a lot easier, right? Like if you say to if 25% of people in a country reduce the amount of electrical demand they're creating by buying more efficient appliances, or buying, just going with the appliances that they already have, not buying a second TV, not buying a second fridge, all that stuff makes the role of a technology advocate a lot easier. I think that when he made this film, he's like, "Oh, okay, it's the lower consumption people versus the technology people, and they're fighting each other, and I'm on this side and they're on that side." But of course, when you work in, like, when you have familiarity with this industry, and I worked in it for a long time, you realize that the energy efficiency people and the lower consumption people love the technology people, and vice versa. Because it's like this pincer movement on the coal, and you can see it in the UK's power generation history, like almost perfectly. It's the reduced demand from UK electricity and the increase in renewable share, and then gas has just remained as this sort of like steady band. And it's the two philosophies coming together that have killed coal in the UK. And it's just the reality is there's no fight between these two ideas. Like there's no debate. It's not like the people who are advocating for solar and wind are being like, "You have to consume as much as you possibly can. Growth is amazing. Like, the human population should triple in the next year." Like it's like, who are you arguing against? It's so strange.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. And I think actually it's not the clean tech industries who are really going for like unprecedented growth kind of thing. If you were to look about how many, even as oil and gas companies, they put together like decarbonizing targets, like the amount of new licenses they're exploring for and target kind of thing, and even at a low oil price, like that and stuff, we have more oil than we can actually burn kind of thing. They're still like spending millions and millions of pounds to actually go deeper down into more remote areas, and the whole idea of fairy tale drilling in the Arctic have not gone away, it's just being on hold.
Yeah. I mean, so this is what I'm working on at the moment, actually, is oil and gas companies in Australia are doing two things. One, they're saying that they're acting on climate change and setting targets that are aligned with the Paris Agreement and stuff like that. And the other thing they're saying is, we are going to expand our fossil fuel extraction operations beyond your wildest dreams. It's just we're going to dig up the whole world. It's going to be incredible. We're going to just get so much fossil fuels out of the ground. And then they'll take a breath and they'll be like, "But we're also abiding by the Paris Agreement and not being." And I'm like, wow, that's incredible. Like the sort of mix, the changes in messaging. And so, I was doing a bit of digging into BP's old, it's not old. I think it was like, what was it? 2018, 2019, the scenarios. I forgot the sort of sketches that they did of like the future.
Like the Energy Outlook, the BP's annual Energy Outlook.
I can't quite remember the name, and I'm starting to wonder if maybe it was Shell. I've been buried in like oil and gas companies for the past like 2 weeks, so my brain, I just can't, I can't like think clearly about them anymore. But basically one of these, I'm pretty sure it was Shell now that I think about it, but they did the scenario sort of outlook, and it's come up in, sorry, it was Shell, because it's come up in their net zero by 2050 plan as well, where part of what they're really bullish about is increased demand into the future. They're just like, well, don't worry, because there's going to be huge demand for energy going into the next 3 decades. And so that's why when I watched that documentary, I'm like, shouldn't you be arguing with Shell right now? Like, shouldn't they be your problem? Because they're the ones who are basically justifying truly stunning amounts of environmental harm on the very philosophy that he has the biggest problem with, which is eternal growth. So, you know, it's just so strange. And the other thing that's worth mentioning is that people in the clean energy industry are very keenly aware of what the next decade is going to look like, in terms of their own ability to build new things, right? They're already starting to encounter these hurdles. And Germany is probably a really good example at the moment, where the growth of wind has been pretty good. But what they're actually starting to see is that it's actually a really complicated and tricky process to build out a transmission network that can accommodate new wind farms, right? So you've kind of got this really windy area up north, and you've got a lot of people living down south, and you've got to transport that wind resource from the north to the south. And a lot of people have been protesting those transmission lines. There have been complications about the cost of the transmission lines, partly because people were protesting them. They said, okay, we'll put them underground, but that's, you know, it's a lot more expensive. So what they're suddenly realizing is that you can't just sort of walk up to a grid and say, I want to build a solar panel or a wind turbine anymore. Now the people who are proposing these new technologies have to almost become grid planners themselves. Like, they have to think about the optimal place to put them, where you can kind of have these, like, in Australia, there's a plan from the grid operator called the Integrated System Plan, or ISP. I've just got a new blog post out, actually, that's sort of a follow-up to my first one, that is really just a bunch of technical stuff, like some of the holes in my first, like, I wrote it when I was very angry. So I thought I would do some of the explaining of, like, you know, where the world is kind of at now with clean energy. And so now there's a lot more of a planning philosophy underneath new wind and solar, right? Like, you kind of have to take part in the future of the grid if you want to build a big solar farm or a big wind farm. No one who is dealing with that process is also saying, I would love for demand to triple in the next 2 years, or like 5 years, or 10 years. All they want is to just get the basic stuff done, because when you kind of go past a 50% share of wind and solar in a grid, you actually really need to start thinking about all of these extra things. So you need to start thinking about dispatchability. You need to start thinking about frequency control, voltage control. So that's not a bad thing to think about. That's good. It's really good to see it just happening in so many places, but it means the pace of change slows. And it means that the people who are advocating for these technologies aren't dreaming about massive growth in demand. They're not. It's really not at the top of their mind. Yeah.
And just, I know you're going to go soon, but just like a final point about technology. So various kind of analysis of the film is like looking at, okay, they're looking at technology from 2010, and obviously outdated technology. And I think that's fine, but I think that's also, I don't know if you thought this, but it's a fine line in actually saying that, okay, outdated technology, of course it was bad, and not saying that, okay, the renewable technology is not as good in 2020 as it is today, but it wasn't bad in 2010. You know, it was better. As efficiency of solar panel was better in 2010 than it was in 1970 on the first Earth Day. You know, so it's just, there's obviously a balance, actually, trajectory every 5-10 years. Like the technology gets so much better and increases by so much efficiency, and the the scalability of it kind of just increases.
Yeah, it's a great point. I wish I had put this into my blog post, and I realized it afterwards, that if that documentary had come out in the year 2012, it still would have been bad. it still would have been inaccurate. Like you know, they still would have visited this site that was, you know, not what they say it is and all that sort of stuff, right? It still would have been fallacious to say that you shouldn't build a wind turbine or a solar panel because it involves fossil fuels in its manufacture. It still would have been completely inaccurate to say that you get more fossil fuels, you know, producing a turbine than it ever offsets during its lifetime. All those things were still wrong in 2012. I guess what I was sort of getting at in my blog, and I wish I'd kind of been a little bit more careful in expressing it, is that these ideas, the ideas are old because they were kind of created in one big kind of go in that era. They were part of a much bigger, broader push from a whole bunch of sort of climate denial and fossil fuel advocacy groups around the world, who were really seizing on this strange momentum that they had back then. Like, you know, it's funny. What I did was I went back and looked at some of my old tweets. I looked back at some of these old articles, like some ones that I wrote and some ones that were written in Australian newspapers at the time. And it was another world. You know, it was just so common to open up the newspaper and the front, like just the biggest headline would be something like, "The sunspots are causing global warming, not fossil fuels," or whatever. And you don't see that in a major newspaper these
No, you
days,
don't
right?
actually. It's really moved on a lot since like in the last decade. Yeah.
So in the same way that headline, of course, is still wrong, it would still be strange. It would still be anachronistic for someone to do a documentary about global warming now, and have the very first thing being like, "I interviewed a scientist and he said that sunspots are causing global warming." So yeah, that's but it's a shame really, because in 2012, you know, the technology was actually pretty good, and it was really dealing with a whole bunch of challenges, these sort of like socio-cultural and political challenges that were just coming up, and like a lot of us in the industry at that time were just like, "Oh wow, you know, I don't know how to deal with this," and it took us a whole decade to get over it, and now it's hopefully briefly it's back. But hopefully it kind of just fades off, because I think it's been quite a damaging and sad thing to see emerge.
Well, I think it will hopefully fade up, but probably need people like you and other people who just let it are quite quick to fact check stuff and just come out with really hard facts that can't be argued with. And your article, like, that did the rounds, and it's been used to go around Twitter as one of the key articles highlighted of why this film was so incorrect and so bad.
Yeah, that's really awesome, and I'm glad people read it, and I really appreciate it. It's very nice.
Great, actually. Thanks a lot, Ketan, and I'm sure there's much more to talk about. And it would be great to catch up with you another time and talk about your book and Australian energy policy and the climate movement in Australia. Also a very fascinating subject.
I would love to.
Great. Have a good one. Cheers. Thanks for joining.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.